It's saying wait for Beata to start the session, so I don't know if you have to start it on your end, Beata.
It says you are live and we started recording. I think we've got 13 people in. Yes, I can see. Brilliant. Okay, and I just switched on comments. Right. I'm going to start this session with some statistics. If you are poor and get arrested in America, you go to jail. If you are rich, you go home. If you are black, you are 9 times more likely than a white person to be stopped and searched by police in the UK. 1 in 4 black American men will go to prison at some point in their lives. If you are too poor to pay a fine in America, you go to jail, lose your job, and get banned from driving your car. Around 1 in 5 people in US jails are there because they can't pay a fine. 70% are there because they can't afford bail. And 50% of people serving time in America have a diagnosed mental illness. A few real changes in business. Recent one we've seen. Microsoft and IBM terminated and or refused to contract with law enforcement for the sale of facial recognition technology over concerns of racial profiling. Shareholder action resulted in Microsoft creating an industry-leading program for screening for prison labor in its supply chain. The French state pension fund blacklisted the US Treasury market due to the United States use of the death penalty. JPMorgan stopped financing the largest operators of private prisons and immigrant detention centers. Undoubtedly, businesses are powerful catalysts for change. The role of investors in ending mass incarceration, in rebuilding criminal justice reform is enormous. But do we know how? Do we know where are the main stumbling blocks? Now, welcome to this session, CEO of Responsible Business Initiative for Justice, Celia Ouellette.
Hi, Beata. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks TBLI for having me too.
Thank you. And thank you, Robert, for inviting, for having pleasure of meeting Celia and learning more about Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. We've got UN Principle for Responsible Principles for bankers, for investors. Now we're looking at justice.
Mm-hmm.
Celia, the first question, what led you to create Responsible Business Initiative for Justice? And who is real Celia?
So thanks for giving me a really nice, easy question to start with, Beata. So I'm a lawyer originally by training and actually practiced my entire career in the US, despite my accent, predominantly working on death penalty cases, defending death penalty cases, primarily cases pre-trial. So people who are facing the death penalty, but ideally don't end up going to death row. And the sort of driver behind the creation of RBIJ lay in that work, which was that there was a clear need for the criminal justice reform community in America, those organizers and campaigners working on the ground, grassroots campaigners in particular, who are they are doing the work that makes the system fairer for my clients. You know, when I would talk to a client and discuss with them, for example, a plea agreement, and they would rightfully complain that they were being forced into taking a life without the possibility of parole plea in place of getting a death sentence. And, you know, as a lawyer, I'm advising them to take take that plea as a better deal than what they're currently looking at. And they would complain bitterly about the choices that they were facing and the unfairness of the system that they were in. And none of them were wrong. And there is a sort of army, increasingly growing army, now includes major celebrity activists, bipartisan lawmakers, increasing number of big recognizable brand businesses that are involved in changing that unfairness and making those choices and options different for people who were my clients. And there was this essential and critical need to engage particularly businesses in that process. Businesses were and are stakeholders, either through their own activities and internal practices or through their sort of community leadership roles, whether they want them or not. That's certainly something that has happened to businesses, especially this year. And the campaigners and organizers on the ground need businesses. Traditionally, we're talking about a group of people trying to create change who have had power systematically taken away from them. For example, in America, if you have a felony conviction in some states, you lose the right to vote. So we're talking about people that even beyond the prison gates are very powerless. And I say that in a deeply respectful way. Like, this is not that they're, victims or powerless, but they have had power systematically taken away from them. And so in building any campaign, you need to think about that power analysis and think about like how you build powerful allies on your side of the table. And at the same time, businesses were increasingly reaching across the aisle and saying, we want to be active participants in social and racial justice. We understand that the criminal justice system is a major kind of component of fixing those problems in communities. How do we do it? So we set ourselves up as the organization that was the glue between those community organizations wanting businesses to help and wanting them to help in like effective ways, and businesses saying, we want to be effective allies, but we're not 100% sure how to do that. We keep getting told, we need to listen to the community, but like, what does that actually mean? Like, where do we sit and who do we listen to? And so that's been our role for the last few years with the organization that I run.
I see, and I just want to respond to a couple of comments. Yes, 13th, absolutely. Watch 13. If you haven't watched, please watch 13th. And that was one of during our prep call, that's something we discussed, modern slavery. And I guess that's what we're looking at. We're looking at businesses. We're looking at turning the tap off and on as and where modern slavery equals mass imprisonment, using the labor.
Prison labor is a major component. When we think about an investment community and we think about asset managers and fund managers, and we're thinking about, what is their role? Why is this relevant to them? And what is their role in kind of turning on and turning off the tap in turning off the tap on sort of mass incarceration, let's call it that, and turning on the tap on alternatives. Prison labor is something that you can screen for in your supply chain. You gave the example of Microsoft, which has kind of created an incredibly sophisticated system for screening for prison labor in its supply chain. And I think that prison labor is something that has really kind of gone from a problem that existed, an emergency that existed, to a public health emergency. When I think about a state like Arkansas that extensively uses prison labor, and in some of the prison facilities, departments of corrections that were using prison labor, because men were stuffed into trailers together and sleeping, in 50-person dorms together, the spread of COVID actually, the virus spread so quickly through communities that couldn't socially distance and were being forced to work in these conditions, that it became a public health crisis to the state and to surrounding counties because of how many people in these facilities were being infected. And when we talk about prison labor, I think people think, well, if you're in prison, you should work. But we're talking about people who are picking cotton. The first time I went to a prison farm in Texas and saw black men in white jumpsuits bent over in fields, I remember I was with somebody else, with another lawyer, and I was like, what are they doing? Like, what are they doing? And I still feel sick realizing that they were picking cotton. Like, picking cotton in the South as a black man means when you're deprived of liberty and you're not being paid, sounds an awful lot like slavery. And I think the reality of it is we need to look at it in that same light. We need to think about people who are not being paid to work. And if they don't work, they're usually put in solitary confinement in the hole, which has caused another problem with COVID, because solitary confinement has been used as a place to segregate people who are sick to the extent that they can do that. But they've been putting people who've been refusing to work because they don't want to get sick in the hole too. So, screening for prison labor is something that's like very, very relevant and like a kind of key action point that we're working on.
But also, you mentioned picking cotton. If you are looking at second chances and creating real job opportunities and putting them back to communities, how efficient, what skill set you develop if you picking cotton rather than, for example, learning or using the latest technology so they can slide in on release, on the re-entrance community.
You want to hear something super crazy? Even in prison labor where there is a skill involved, for example, in California, you can be a firefighter, you can be an inmate firefighter. And this is largely because not many people want to fight California wildfires because they are unbelievably dangerous as a former California resident. But up until this summer, where California experienced the worst wildfires it's ever experienced, you were not eligible to be a firefighter after release. Even if
you had a criminal record.
Yeah. So you would go through the process of being trained to be a firefighter, being a firefighter while an inmate. And then upon release, you would lose your eligibility to apply to be a California firefighter. And this is true there were about 40,000 collateral consequences. So that means, hurdles to being employed, hurdles to getting housing, hurdles to having employment, education. If you are a barber you cut hair in a jail or a prison, in some states, you can't get a professional cosmetology license. So you can't then even use that skill when you get out because of these systematic barriers that sit in your way. And, you and I both sort of have a moral and emotional reaction to this, but there's also like a very kind of dollars and cents reaction to this, which I think anyone listening to this, and where I come from on this some of the time too, is like, that's my money. That's my taxpayer money being used to pay for somebody to be incarcerated and then being wasted when they get out. And it's sort of wasted in two separate ways. Way one is, if you don't help people get back onto their feet, if you don't give them a second chance to get back onto their feet after their time is done, then they are very likely to return to prison. And in America, those reoffending statistics are very, very, very high. About 75% of people will go back to prison at some point within a decade of leaving prison. And a major solution to that is getting people established with jobs and houses and appropriate healthcare. And then the second consequence of that is, if you unemploy or underemploy a large percentage of the population, in America, it's estimated about 80 billion in lost GDP as a result of this workforce being able to work but not working. So there's just sort of it doesn't work morally or sort of from a human rights or a sort of dignity of the person perspective. And actually, if you strip away all of that moral or values-based approach, it doesn't work on paper. It doesn't work on the balance sheet either. I think we'll see
money talks.
Yeah.
Money talks.
Yeah.
How can we turn this into a business opportunity? How can we get the governor, the federal government, the local government to turn this into a business opportunity? Because we were talking about turning the tap off and on something which does make sense. And we were talking about the cost of someone being incarcerated for a year in the US, $30,000.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like school fees for one of the top law schools.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how much would have been saved if things wouldn't have to happen, first of all, in the first place, or we have removed I'm going to use the word parasites, people who do parasite on the system, benefiting from that person being in prison.
Yeah.
Or just staying, you know, staying indifferent to the system, not putting the work in.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of overarching solutions in a very, very, very general sense are to reduce mass incarceration in its very sort of simplest form, and to invest in re-entry services, invest in the process of people re-entering the community after a prison sentence. Like if we break it down to those kind of broad strokes boxes, and they are also the same boxes that were sort of beta tested through the COVID decarceration. So in response to the spread of COVID in prisons and jails, some states did reduce their prison populations, and the outcome of that wasn't a massive reduction in crime, a massive increase in crime, or a sort of danger to the community. And in fact, it had this like public health benefit. And so we sort of tested what this looks like this last year in a very kind of rough and ready way, and the outcome has been pretty good, right? So if we're thinking about
COVID was that litmus test, really. We certain minor offenses, or I think you mentioned elderly prisoners, and it worked.
Yeah, right. And I think the other thing that COVID did, was make people look quite a lot at who wasn't. And exactly as you say, in America, 20% of inmates are over 50. And that's because we have such long sentencing, and things like 3 strikes and mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing, which is where you serve every single last year of a sentence that you're given, have meant that we have a really aging population of prisoners who are especially vulnerable. We had a lot of women, and we have a lot of children in the justice system in America too. But, if we think about like, what is the business role? What is the investor's role in being a kind of catalyst for change and seeing opportunities for change? I think that also breaks down quite simply into, divest and invest in some respects, right? Divest from things that are supporting the prison industrial complex, immigration detention, police in some instances. I'm going to say that with like kind of caution, and private service providers to the justice system. So private probation and parole services, bail, cash bail, loans, surveillance, I think is a kind of key one too. And what do you sort of invest in instead? Really what we're talking about is investing in things in communities that promote diversity. A good example perhaps would be like community development financial institutions who will give loans to people who are traditionally underserved by the banking community. So I think a lot of the solutions, we can look at solutions that are dead on the nose. I know you and I talked a little bit about like Fintech solutions. In California, there was a ballot initiative this year, which was designed to replace California's process of cash bail, which is exactly what it sounds like, which is if you are arrested, you get a bail amount set on you as a person, and it's irrespective of your flight risk or your danger. And if you can't pay it, you go to jail. So, you and I probably wouldn't go to jail, but somebody who doesn't have a good job and, isn't sort of educated and white probably would go to jail. So, in California, there was an effort to replace the cash bail process with an algorithm that would actually assess somebody's danger to the community. In theory, awesome, widely opposed even by progressive justice reform campaign groups like the ACLU, on the basis that they haven't quite got the technology right yet to eliminate racial bias in creating the programs in the questions that are being asked and need to be answered in order to make an assessment of somebody's potential danger to the community haven't quite been fine-tuned enough yet. That divided some, but I think we're kind of getting there. Like, I think that there is innovation, there are marketplace solutions to some of the problems we have in the justice system. But, above all, what we're really trying to do is shrink the justice system. This whole summer we've been hearing defund the police, which is, Obama has, recently talked about that potentially being divisive. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. For me, what I always say when we talk about defund the police is what we're really talking about is reallocating finances and investing more into things that increase prosperity in communities, that increase diversity in communities, that increase equity in communities, and decreasing funding in things that deplete that. And it is the case that in America, one of the biggest systems, standalone systems that depletes that is the justice system, which is why you keep hearing divest and reduce the justice system. But this doesn't mean you don't put anything in its stead. It means that you replace it with something which is much more kind of community oriented and designed to lift communities up rather than pull them down and keep them down.
I have private probation, private system, private prison. If I shift that money into the education, into the training, into supporting single moms, single dads, youth, creating activities, I'm already preventing. And then when I'm using that money into second chance programs, again, that's a huge benefit. So how do we then create something where, say you speak to JPMorgan or Citi, someone, you bring your banks, financial institutions to the table.
Yep.
What would be your wish list?
Well, JPMorgan is a really good example because JPMorgan has kind of set the ceiling right now for businesses in America. JPMorgan has been one of the most active businesses on criminal justice reform in the States. Bank of America is right there with them. And then some of the smaller banks like Fifth Third Bank have been very, very active too. So what has JPMorgan done well? What are the kind of lessons learned from what JPMorgan has done? JPMorgan has been front and center on advocacy. And I think this is a place that's very exciting for us in working with fund managers and investors and the investment community, because I think this is a community that has a similar opportunity for advocacy as businesses do. So JPMorgan, their criminal justice reform policy lead will say in quite simple terms, we get into rooms that the campaigners and organizers don't get into, and we will use that opportunity to deliver the messaging of the campaign movement. That's what we mean by advocacy. They're also very involved in public education. They recognize that they have a huge platform and a large number of customers and employees. And so they're using that platform to educate. I think in America, we talk a lot about otherness, this concept that sort of built in the late 80s and 90s around sort of Willie Horton politics of, super predators and leopards don't change their spots. And when you have people with the platform that Jamie Dimon has saying this isn't really correct and there's more to this narrative and you need to unpack this narrative, that is very, very powerful. They're very influential advocates within their community too. So JPMorgan has been extremely active, for example, with the Business Roundtable, and the Business Roundtable a few weeks ago announced an extremely ambitious and thorough and not progressive, because it's not progressive in the political sense, but progressive in the sense that it's a lot for a business membership organization to take on policy platform around justice reform. And JPMorgan has also kind of cleaned house too. And this is, another thing that businesses need to be thinking about doing. They've committed to hiring 10% of their workforce from people that are formerly incarcerated. Which is not super easy for a bank because banks are restricted in some of their hiring. Something that they're challenging is that restriction, that they should be allowed to make decisions about who they want to hire. And if they have a criminal conviction, it's up to them to decide whether they're an appropriate person for that job.
But is this just lip service, a response to George Floyd, response to Brief Act, which Biden is going to put in place as soon as he becomes a president? Is this just a lip service?
Well, for JPMorgan, look, I'm not paid by JPMorgan, so I'm not like their brand ambassador, but, as an honest person from the campaign community, JPMorgan was there long before George Floyd. JPMorgan has been kind of out on the front of this since, I'm not going to do them any favors, but at least 2017, which is when I built RBIJ. So, they're sort of in it for the long haul. I do think that there's a real concern that some of the businesses that have spoken out this summer, including financial institutions, haven't really set accountability measures or really disclosed what their KPIs are around what they are going to do with the justice system. You know, I think sometimes we sniff them out pretty quick, because when we talk about, okay, this is awesome, you're a big investor in the state of Ohio, and, you know, there's a criminal justice reform bill pending there right now, and we would love you to be involved in that. And they're like, wow, you know, we'll do some comms, but we're not really keen on like digging in at the coalface. But that's not universally the case. And I think that a major solution, you know, I think the investment community is a major solution to that, right? This is a group of people that can hold businesses' feet to the fire through shareholder activism, through disclosures, through proxy voting, through letter writing. And they're financially incentivized to make sure that this happens. You know, we have seen big companies' share prices tumble because of justice and being on the sort of wrong side of history on justice issues. And I think that joint accountability is something that we're going to be working on a lot in 2021. We see that one of the best ways to get businesses, one of the other good ways to get businesses to remain accountable is actually make them accountable to one another, that they don't want to be the business that does the least in any particular group. So kind of cohorting businesses together. I think Business Roundtable is a really good example of this, you know, that no one wants to be on the justice reform working group and be the business that has done the least to support change on that group. So I think this is the sort of this is sort of 2.0 for businesses, is joint activity and joint accountability. It'll take some time to build. Like, I'm not naive to the fact that we're going to lose some along the way. But I do think that there is an appetite for publishing how businesses are getting along.
So I've mentioned at the beginning, I've mentioned UN principles for responsible investors, or responsible banks. What would be, say, your 5 principles for responsible business to initiate, to embed justice or social justice into their businesses, into their portfolios?
From an investment perspective, like, what are the kind of principles? You know, I think...
Yes. If we were going to create a charter, of 5 principles,
so
my wish list.
So number one, I think it's important to say that this work has not really been done yet, and this is our work for 2021. So, you know, if I have a call to action, now it is that we are in the process of assembling a working group to do that work and publish by the end of 2021 a set of principles that will provide clarity around what investors need to do. But if we want to kind of talk in broad strokes about like what should be, you know, what kind of things are we looking at to be included in that, you know, we are talking about divesting from companies that support the prison industrial complex through building prisons, supplying to prisons like healthcare services and phone services and food service suppliers to a certain extent to prisons.
So divest and create opportunity earlier on while you're in prison, or create
opportunity in the community, like look for opportunities to build opportunity in the community in place of investment in the prison industrial complex. Let's kind of call it that broadly, but that includes surveillance, probation, and cash bail. You know, I think another really, you and I talked about this before, and I think like another really big place that we should be looking at is municipal bonds, is through the issuance of municipal bonds. And I think that there's an opportunity for activism here too. You know, you mentioned the French State Pension Fund ERAF's work around this. And I think there is both a kind of turning off the tap opportunity here and also an advocacy opportunity here. So, you know, if an investor listening to this wants to do one thing, that would probably be look at your municipal bonds and see what they're issued for. Because if they are issued for debt in order to build new prisons, then that's something you can do right now and say, we will not be buying municipal bonds for the construction of new prisons. But there's also this advocacy angle, which is speaking about not investing in certain locations or in certain counties. So in Arab's case, they actually applied that to the entire United States because of the US's use of capital punishment. But if you wanted to look at a more sort of granular level, you could look at counties that have large settlements, have issued debt, not always traceable, but bonds for debt, for police settlements, for police brutality cases, or that have fines and fees structures that provide revenue to the county. So what this means is that, in some counties,
there's an incentive.
Yeah, there's a financial incentive to levy fines and fees on people who can't pay them. From an investor's perspective, it's not actually a very good investment, because if you can tell someone that they need to pay £1 million, but if they don't have $10, they're not going to pay even $10. So looking at county revenue from fines and fees is a good way of a kind of litmus test for how that particular county is extractive and is taking is extracting resources from people who can pay it the least, and has a justice system that is supported by people who are essentially in poverty, looking at people who are in poverty. And so I think that there is,
and yet we're spending $30,000 a year that in poverty can't pay $5, $10, $15, $20, and they then be spent $30,000 a year to keep them in prison.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about philanthropy, right? If we're thinking about massive investors with philanthropy, we talk about Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg this summer decided to pay off the court debt of thousands of people with felony convictions in the state of Florida, because although Florida had allowed many of them to vote, even though they had a felony, which took years to accomplish by campaigners and advocates on the ground, they were told that they would only be able to vote once they paid all their court debt, which in many cases is just completely impossible. So Bloomberg actually stepped in and said, I'll pay all your court debt, which I think created a lot of headaches. But interestingly, actually at the county level, what Michael Bloomberg was saying was, you've got unpaid debt in your county. You've got revenue that you're not currently collecting. Isn't this a win-win? You can collect it, I'll pay it, and then these people can vote. So, I think looking at a municipal level or a state level or treasury at bonds, what bonds are being issued for, and what is the activity of that municipality that is issuing that bond. You can pretty quickly answer, research around this is quite difficult, due diligence around this is quite difficult, but there are sort of foundational questions you can ask that are binary. Does the state use the death penalty? Does the state use juvenile life without parole? What is going on with police violence in that state in terms of at least settlement amounts that have been issued for settling brutality cases? Is the state, like Alabama, responding to a prison crisis, a prison conditions crisis, by building more prisons rather than reducing the number of people in them? So there is a series of questions you can ask yourself about, what is this community doing? Is it helping or hurting the community through the justice system? And then you can make decisions around whether you will invest in those or blacklist those. And then sort of step two is talk publicly about the fact that you are blacklisting them and why, because that helps us, on the kind of coalface considerably.
So going back to my question, I have 6 principles of responsible business initiatives. So I'm going to have you, and PRI has 6. We can formulate 1, create opportunities. By create opportunities, create these skills while in prison, so they can then, and I think you mentioned the call center, women who are working for call centers in prison, and then basically, off the jumpsuit, when they leave prison, when they are being released, they can take on and they might not end up in that job, for next few years, but they have a job to go to. That's already big. So the first one would be have that collaboration, create that opportunity. Would the second be do your due diligence?
Require disclosures that refer specifically to justice system engagement.
Be transparent. Yes.
Demand transparency from the business that you invest in. And like just to kind of follow up on the point about the call center, this is a really good example about why due diligence is important, because this is a company that hires people who are currently incarcerated for jobs because they recognize that the jump from the prison gates to the community is the place where people most frequently fail. This is prison labor. Right? Technically, this is people who are inside are working for a for-profit company. But the purpose of that labor and the way that it's structured, and it's run by a formerly incarcerated woman, is designed as a re-entry service provision. So if you're looking for companies to invest in, if one of our principles is invest in companies that are restorative and provide a re-entry service, you can find that reasonably easily. These are companies like Cisco that are investing in training and education for people who are currently incarcerated, skills training so that they have them, they're more likely to succeed when they leave, who are providing a specific re-entry service provision like Televerde, the call company that we just referred to. And generally speaking, these are companies that do engage in what we call second chance hiring. So they are companies that have publicly committed. This isn't ban the box. This isn't, we don't care if you've got a criminal conviction or not. This is companies that are saying, if you have a criminal conviction, you can apply for a job with us. We will consider you with a criminal conviction. So those are very, if you're trying to assemble a portfolio of businesses that is restorative to the community, that would be a great kind of portfolio, kind of set of principles for investing in private or public markets. And like second chance hiring isn't sort of a wacky small town mom and pop shop thing. Big companies are like Georgia Pacific are big second chance hirers. They'll hire people. A lot of the time it's manufacturing and retail sector, restaurant sector too. And actually, interestingly, I know I'm going on a tangent here, but like investors can be a conduit to that. So a really good example is a big investment manager, investor in, actually he's a private investor, but high net worth individual, invested in Bojangles. So he himself probably employs a handful of people to work for him. He should be looking for opportunities to hire people with convictions, or at least not excluding people with convictions from his staff. But like more realistically, he made this massive investment in a fried chicken company in North Carolina. And one of his first activities as a major stakeholder in this company was to work with the company to ensure that they were a second chance hirer. And what that looked like was hiring an external consultancy, a company called Envoy Growth, which is great. And that company literally sat with the HR managers and helped them fill out the forms for insurance and liability, helped them figure out screening questions to make sure that they were not sort of embedding racism in any of their questions and that they were really hiring the right people for the right jobs. And so that company now, as a result of that sort of internal activism, is that the company is a second chance hirer in the state of North Carolina.
So create second chance program, second chance pledge.
Yeah, there are specific. Like Obama had a second chance pledge. The Society for Human Resource Management, or even companies that say we are from tomorrow going to be accepting people with criminal convictions. Look,
how about? How about? I mean, both of us are lawyers. Yes, I am. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking how can we incentivize investors? How can we create a finance product? And there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to be creative, to create, whether it's a bond, whether we securitize. I mean, we've seen subprimes. Come on. I mean, we could create another similar product which is focused. The use of revenues are being focused for that industry, so we can create the eligibility and selection criteria. What I want you to say is and for people who watch 13, 1970, okay, so 50 years ago, more than 300,000 people were in prison. Now,
2.2 million.
2.2 million and 700,000 being released every year. Okay, so I am thinking, I've got 2.2 million people in the US Okay, how many criminal lawyers are out there? How about if law firms are signing up to a pro bono pledge and say, well, let's sift through the system and give everyone an opportunity. Every law firm will take few cases on, okay, and get that support. That might be a program, and see how many of these people will be able to release.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, law firms like have a major role to play in this. And I think law firms could be much more involved in things like applications for record clearance, what we call expungement. Actually, this is an interesting place where there's a fintech solution, by the way. So, you know,
and you know what? And I'm glad you're saying that. I'm gonna interrupt. I'm glad you're saying that, because ESG and looking at, you know, I don't know whether you attended talks. Is we've got, and I've seen Christopher is there. We had a talk last night about blockchain, about technology. Everyone is looking at ESG, how we can make it efficient, how we can use science and technology. So yes, how can we?
Yeah, I mean, so clean slate, I know we were talking about lawyers, right? Because lawyers, this is work that doesn't really require any particular level of expertise. But lawyers can offer pro bono hours, and some law firms have. I would add that some states have put up considerable barriers to law firms being able to offer pro bono services to people who are in prison. And some companies and law firms have taken on fighting that. So I know that, for example, Koch Industries fought a battle in Kansas, I think, which is their home jurisdiction, for their in-house lawyers to be able to take on pro bono criminal cases because they were prevented from doing so. And I also know in Alabama, there's a lot of restrictions on lawyers taking on pro bono criminal cases. So the state of Alabama has, the Attorney General has prevented it. So, you know, this is to say that there is a considerable opposition to anything that is a solution, but that doesn't mean we stop, right? Like, we do hard things. That's the point. But let's talk about the fintech solution. So clean slate legislation is a really good example of this. And this is a really good example of like the whole system in motion. Okay. So, in certain states in America, let's take Michigan, because clean slate legislation passed in Michigan this year. You are entitled to have certain criminal records, certain criminal convictions cleared from your record after a period of time. So once a certain period of time has passed with no new convictions, you are entitled to have it removed from your rap sheet, basically. But the process of doing that is expensive and quite complicated. When I was a little baby lawyer in the early days, this was one of the things I used to do, was fill out the expungement application forms for people. So it's definitely something appropriate for pro bono law firm, because it doesn't require like super expertise in criminal law. But to people who are poor, it's more complicated and costly than is really realistic. So a lot of people who are eligible to have their record cleared don't get their record cleared. So policy and innovation sitting side by side on clean slate has resulted in campaigners and activists and organizers lobbying and working on pieces of legislation that would automate the process so the court record system would be, in a lot of places, court records are not even electronic. So it would make court records electronic. And after a certain period of time, a piece of software would recognize if you've reached a certain level of maturity on your criminal conviction with no criminal convictions, and it falls into a certain category, and you would automatically become eligible for expungement through a software screening program. So getting these systems in place requires legislation. A court needs to, a legislature needs to agree that their justice system will now have an automated process of expungement, and the technology needs to exist in order to make it happen. And then a kind of third strand of this, which is really, really interesting in America, is someone needs to pay for that. Somebody needs to pay for that technology. This is a for-profit company that is providing this technology service. And so the federal government is involved in issuing grants and allocating funding to states that want to follow this process. And the outcome of this is that people can re-enter the workforce, right? Like really, really the benefit of this from an economic and business perspective is that
they don't need to be scared of that interview question.
Exactly. So, there's been great studies on even if you can apply for a job, the attrition rate of people when they get to the question, do you have criminal conviction, of them stopping filling out an application.
Yeah. So, I think you mentioned JPMorgan. I think JPMorgan last year, because they've launched a specific, I think more than a year ago, November 2019, they have actually removed that question from the application form.
Right.
I don't know whether, this is for specific positions, because obviously, if you're working with money and so on, that would require different level of scrutiny, but that would be another example. Right. I see Glenn made a comment, too many communities are making money from the incarcerated, in some cases over 40K per prisoner per year. How do you address this in a solution? I think we have touched on that. Yes, there are too many people being subsidized by government.
Yeah, I think maybe we can just kind of sit on it for a minute and we'll return to that Arkansas example. So, in the state of Arkansas, at one point, the governor was not including the infection rates from a particular Department of Corrections unit because they were so high. They were 20 times, the infection rate in this particular prison was 20 times the rest of the state. So they started to exclude those numbers from the state. And if you kind of take off the lid and want to understand why that was happening, I mean, there are a number of reasons why that was happening, due to inability to social distance, hand sanitizer is a contraband. But one of the biggest components was that the healthcare services in that prison were outsourced to a for-profit healthcare provider that was being paid $370 per inmate per month. And numerous nurses and former employees have now reached out to the press and said, we were told to cut every single corner we possibly could. Which kind of makes sense, right? It's awful, but it makes sense. You have a company that is financially incentivized to do the least. They had one doctor for 2,000 inmates, and that doctor had been suspended 3 times previously. So you're sort of setting yourself up to fail by creating this. So what is one of the ways that you can prevent companies like this from existing? Well, you can starve them out at the root. And we've seen that happen, in ways that are catastrophic to the business, intentionally catastrophic to the business, and catastrophic to the investors. There was an investor, I'm forgetting his name, Tom Gores, who lost his seat. For example, there was a major campaign by activists and campaigners in the US to kick him off the board of the LA Art Museum, LACMA. As a result of his significant investment in Securus, which is a prison telephone company that would charge sort of predatory rates up to sort of $25 for a 15-minute phone call. And so the activists and campaigners in America actually went after the investor and his major stake and personally went after him and caused him considerable reputation damage personally for his investment in this company.
That came up in the 13th. Yeah, that came up in the 13th in the documentary. No, absolutely, yes. How many people are benefiting for just not giving someone a proper chance to?
Yeah, and very predatory. I mean, when we think about what we're really doing is we're depriving people of liberty. We're making a profit from that. They're working for free.
And we're punishing them for the rest of their lives,
yeah.
unless we help them afterwards. So how do we how do we build a broken communities?
Yeah, I mean, so what you invest in communities really closely aligns to sort of racial justice and social justice investment, and it is investing in minority-owned businesses. It is investing in traditionally low-income communities. You know, we talked about like, what are their products? Like, I actually did some research. There is one product that I can find. There should be, let's say there should be 10 by the end of 2021 that specifically invests in bonds for low-income communities, for restoration of low-income communities. So the solutions are, the invest side of this is actually not rocket science. I mean, it's somewhat similar to what we're looking at with the defund the police movement in America. It is like, start investing in mental health service providers, start investing in education, starve out the companies that are predatory and invest in the companies that are building something in its stead. I would always hesitate pretty hard to say invest in justice system based solutions, and say instead invest in things in the community that increase equity and diversity in communities. And everybody breathes a little easier when I say that, because we all know that if we're kind of thinking about opportunities from an ESG perspective, that aligns, right? We know that, lack of diversity and lack of equity and social injustice are ESG risks, right? Impact investing in things that promote diversity are actually seen as a little bit more valuable.
Yeah. And we were talking about this during our prep call, and I said the as analogy, you're looking at divesting from oil and gas to green, green finance, green bonds.
Mm-hmm.
We should be using that analogy. We should be looking at, away from predatory activity to something where we actually create opportunities, create diversity, repair broken communities.
Exactly.
Raise it. So we could be creating a green bond for social justice.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and the example from the environment sort of movement is good. You guys didn't focus on better oil or better coal. You said, no, we don't want to invest in that at all. We want to stop that, and we want to invest in things like, wind or water power or geothermal activity, or whatever it is that is instead of. We're talking about that now. It's like, let's not tinker around with the things that are broken. Let's stop doing them, and let's invest in the things that prevent people from going into prison in the first place. And
set that criteria. Say, okay, the same like we do with green bonds, we could do the same with a set of criteria, eligibility criteria, which I think your company can do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, the second component of this is don't forget your voice too. Don't forget the value of advocacy. Investors as with businesses are, have major social capital with those that can create change. In America, those that can create change are elected. And so you are a major, your voice will be heard in their ears. And that's not just, investors to business, but that's investors to legislators too, and investors within the community. We've seen big investment firms finding their voice increasingly, financial sector actors, we talked about JPMorgan, finding their voice and being kind of willing to take on difficult, in inverted commas, or political inverted commas issues over the past year or so. And I think it's time for the S in ESG to kind of get its moment in the sun, right? And to advance. And I think one of the problems has been it's been quite hard to sort of ring fence, if we want to create change in social justice and racial justice, what are the components of that? How do we break that down into bite-sized pieces where we can say, this changes and that improves? And I think that the criminal justice system is such a big kind of pump for this. We are incarcerated. We talked about this. We go all the way back to the beginning. We talked about how it disproportionately impacts people who are poor and people of color. So, if you're looking at your kind of 2021 goals as an investor right now and thinking, we really want to do something around racial justice, we really want to do something around social justice, thinking about the criminal justice system is actually quite a practical way of tackling that. It's in the same way as saying, we're going to look at, the environment as an entirety, and you would say, well, what is within that? let's look at fossil fuels, and within fossil fuels, let's look at this particular component of it. And the justice system sits within those two issues quite neatly. And it will have impact.
We've got four and a half minutes. I had a couple of other questions, but I see a question from Christopher and Robert. I'm looking at Robert. You and Catherine Flowers are taking on the least sexy topic. How do you stay energized for a relatively unpopular subject, particularly among financial sector? How do you stay energized?
I'm just going to start by saying, number one, it's not the least sexy topic. You got to say, like, this is so much.
No.
This summer, if you aren't
fighting for justice, yes.
I think if you aren't calling yourself a justice warrior, then you're probably falling behind. So,
and for me, as a structured finance lawyer, I mean, I can see the opportunity of creating, and again, I use that analogy. Why not? We've got eligibility criteria. We've got experts who are able to identify what that bond would look like. Yeah. How, when I raise that revenue, how I'm going to allocate that to which community, and again, demonstrate to the investor. That's how much you save. This is the profit, and the governor, how much you save.
Yeah.
One of my questions was, if you were going to be Biden's chief of staff, the chief advisor, what would be your wish list on next 4 years in terms of legislation? We discussed second chances. We discussed perhaps pro bono pledge, which I think, like for example, Ireland, law firms sign up to it. In UK, there is a movement. What would be your wish list?
I mean, my wish list is way too long to talk about in 2 minutes and 37 seconds. But I think that my focus is particularly around the appropriations process. And this kind of dovetails into everything we've talked about, which is that if you can financially, what can the federal government do? It's somewhat limited because most of this activity that we've been talking about in the justice system is actually at the state level. But what the federal government can do is financially incentivize states to do things like adopt clean slate legislation and to reallocate funding from police to mental health services. And so that's my goal. And then one last point, which is, how do we...
go on. So Biden, okay. Yes, Biden, clean slate. Yes.
How do we stay energized on this work? I think, if I could have one last moment on this, it would be like, I think once you've seen this, you don't unsee this, right? And Beata, you spent the week researching this, and I can see you're in that place where you kind of, everything's just clicking and it's madness. And you kind of can't understand how anyone would not see this. So I think doing that homework is kind of step one. I love that someone mentioned 13th. Everyone's got Netflix, watch 13th.
Yes.
But if you kind of want to dig a little bit deeper, like, that is what we do. So when we start with businesses or investors or whoever we're working with, we actually ask them to spend some time listening to people that have been through the justice system and experienced it from various different angles. And the outcome is that they usually see an opportunity for them to behave in a way that is going to create change. And they're pretty motivated to do that because you kind of can't unsee it once you've seen it.
I'm going to touch on something you mentioned. It's S in ESG, but it could be also about E. Friend of mine just sent me a TED talk from David Lammy, and he said climate justice cannot happen without racial justice. I'm going to watch that TED talk. But
I mean, whatever David Lammy says is almost certainly true, is probably my thought on that. I think that's true. When we talk about inequality in our communities and we talk about poverty, these two things are tied together. We can have aspirations about, electric vehicles, but if people can't afford them, then, it's all kind of in an echo chamber. So I absolutely think the E and the S and the G, they are all interlinked and connected.
We've got 12 seconds. We're going to be cut off. Thank you, everyone. What would be your last message? So watch 13, watch Just Mercy. Absolutely. Brian Stevenson, his work. Yeah. And what else?
And email us. We're at Responsible Business Initiative.
Voice. And of course, I'd love to be involved. I'd love to be there to help you to look at that charter, or, you look at that financial instrument, how we can work together with that analogy. I don't know whether we are. Yes, good. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I'm really, I am humbled. I am a rookie in that space, but two willing hands, really happy, willing to help you on your mission.
Great for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And reach out. And we're going to be in touch. I'm going to stop streaming now. I don't know whether we're going to disappear.